Today we're going to talk about the right to own a gun. And we're going to start that out by introducing the topic, talking about some important distinctions within the debate in the first video. And in the second video, we'll get into the heart of Humer's argument that we do have a right to own a gun and that it's not outweighed by any other considerations. So let me share my screen. Okay, so let me start with this warm-up activity. So let's try to think of something that obviously y'all are not responding in real time. This is just for you on your own. I want you to think about something that either contributes a small amount to bad health every time you do it, or puts you at a small risk of death every time you do it. So try to think of one of those things. Again, it's not real time, so I'm going to move on. The examples that come to my mind are, first and foremost, driving. Every time you drive, you're putting your health at risk, as we're painfully reminded sometimes when we see wrecks. Every time you eat fast food, every time you eat barbecue, every time you eat anything that's good, basically, you're doing the first thing, right? So the car example was the second thing. This is the first thing. So now, once you have one of those things in mind, think about exactly how much life expectancy you'd be willing to sacrifice to continue doing that thing, right? This is something we don't often think about when we do these things, but surely it's worth some amount because we're doing it, right? So how much of your life would you sacrifice to keep eating fast food? How much of your life would you sacrifice to keep driving a car? And there's got to be an answer to that question, or else we're all just super weak-willed and we're not doing what we think we ought to do, which is being as healthy as we possibly can. Okay, let's move on. That'll become relevant later on. So we're going to make some important distinctions. This is a lot of distinctions to look at. I understand that, but they'll be important. Okay, so we have the first distinction between fundamental and derivative rights. Fundamental rights have force independent of other rights. It's sort of like, might be easiest to see that just comparing it to derivative rights. Derivative rights are rights that you have because you have a fundamental right. If it weren't for that fundamental right, you wouldn't have the derivative right. So, for example, you have a right to free speech. That's a fundamental right, I think, although maybe not. It might be derivative of the even more fundamental right to, and I guess the more general right to, autonomy, at least in sort of a liberal, broadly speaking, liberal view, is the one fundamental right. You have the right to do what you choose to do. And that's again on the classically liberal conception of political authority, etc. Classically liberal encompasses both our conservative and what we call liberal today viewpoints. Now, it could be derivative of your right to autonomy that you have the right to free speech, because speaking is just a way of doing what you choose to do. And similarly, your right to, your right to vote could also be derivative of your right to autonomy. But let's take, just for a second, it might be that free speech is fundamental. It's unclear. You can see the relation of fundamental to derivative, even if it's not fundamental, by comparing it to your right to publish or to, let's say, publish a newspaper. Again, that's not to say there are no restrictions on that thing, right? So there may be cases where you have to follow certain rules in order to publish a newspaper in a certain town or a certain city or whatever. But your free speech, your right to free speech, sort of includes as a derivative right your right to publish a newspaper. And if those restrictions on it became too severe, we'd say that your right was actually being inhibited. For example, when we have restrictions on political speech, for example. You can't just assemble in any way, in any place, at any time, right? You maybe can't go in certain political buildings at certain times or something like that. You have to get a proper permit to assemble for a protest or something like that in some places. But there's clearly a line that you cross once you cross in terms of restrictions, you've actually inhibited the right, right? So maybe some restrictions are reasonable, but too many and you've restricted the right. You've violated the right, so to speak. Okay, so you have a derivative right. So in this case, we're looking at your right to publish a newspaper, derivative of your more fundamental right to free speech. Now, that's for one distinction. A second distinction is absolute versus prima facie rights. That's how you pronounce that second word. It's Latin. It means kind of on its face, sort of apparent would be the English word for that. An absolute right cannot be overridden. You can't morally violate it. A prima facie right can be overridden as long as you have sufficiently weighty considerations. So you might think that this is up for debate. I'm not saying anything that's universally agreed upon here, but one could argue about the absolute versus prima facie status of your right to free speech. And I think to some extent, we're having this debate kind of implicitly in a lot of our current debates. You might think, look, free speech, we do have a right to free speech, but there are certain considerations that outweigh it. Certain amounts of harm, you might think. I'm just not endorsing this argument, but people have argued that certain kinds of harm done by speech warrant the abridgment of the right to free speech. They're not denying that you have the right. It's just a prima facie right. It's not an absolute right. It can be overridden by certain considerations. An absolute right could not. You could not point out any harm if your right to free speech was absolute. You could not point out any harm done by an act of speech that would justify restricting that speech if it was absolute. And then finally, we're not going to get into this one as much, so I'll skim over it. Overriding versus exceptions, right? You can override a right, and that's different from there being an exception to a right. So you could have a right to free speech. Let's take this example again. It has no exceptions. It's not like certain kinds of speech or certain content of speech is an exception to the right, but your right could be overridden if it's a prima facie right because it caused so much harm. On the other hand, you might think, no, maybe your right to free speech is absolute, but it has certain exceptions, right? Like you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Now you might start thinking we're splitting hairs here, but I don't think so, right? If someone yells fire in a crowded theater, they don't have the right to do that. Some people argue. And it's not like we have to override their right. Even if it's not going to harm anyone, we can stop them from doing that because we think that there's an exception to their right to free speech. Again, this is not uncontroversial. I'm just stating the viewpoint so we can get the distinction down, right? So that would be a case where it didn't take any argument on my part if I'm a proponent of this position to say, well, there's this other stuff that outweighs the right. I say, no, there's an exception to the right. I don't have to show you that there's overriding considerations. Okay, so those are the distinctions. Those are important distinctions in general. This is not just for humorous paper. These are really important distinctions for understanding kind of the logical structure of rights. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about weighing rights, and we're talking specifically here about prima facie rights. So go back, we're looking at this middle distinction, and once you admit that a right is a prima facie right, then you admit that you can weigh it against other considerations to see whether the right ought to be respected or whether it can be infringed. So humor thinks gun rights are prima facie rights. That's why we're going to focus in on that one. But, so that means he thinks the right could be overridden or outweighed. Okay, I'm using those two terms interchangeably. But what does he think about the fundamental versus derivative? Is it a fundamental right or is it a derivative right? Well, he thinks it's actually both. You have a right that's derivative and a right that's fundamental to own a gun. So what does that tell us about the structure, what the structure of his argument is going to look like? Well, because he admits that it's a prima facie right, he admits that it could be outweighed. So what he's going to need to show is that other considerations do not outweigh it, right? So that's what we have to figure out if you admit that your right to own a gun is a prima facie right. So for example, if I think I have a right to light a small campfire at a state park, and we start to argue about it, and you get me to admit that I think it's only a prima facie right, it could be overridden. Well, now we're going to argue about whether it is overridden or outweighed in this case, because then you could argue, oh, so you admit it's prima facie, it could be outweighed by other considerations. And I say, yeah. And you say, okay, well, how about this? It's a drought, and you're lighting that fire poses a 40% chance of setting this whole state park on fire. Doesn't that outweigh your prima facie right? And then we continue arguing about it. Point being, once you admit that the right is prima facie, you enter into you spark the need to establish that it is not outweighed by other considerations. Okay, one more thing, and then we'll stop this video, create another one about humor's main argument. So you might wonder, okay, but how do we figure out how weighty the right is, right? Okay, so the way that weighing stuff works, when we talk literally, let's talk about literal weighing. We're weighing two things against each other, that is. You can think of those old school sort of justice is blind weights where you figure out whether one thing weighs more than the other. What you're trying to figure out is, yeah, when I try to figure out whether something outweighs my right to something, I need to kind of know how much my right weighs, right? So that I can tell whether this thing on the other side weighs more than it, right? So how weighty, so to speak, is my prima facie right? How do we go about figuring that out in general? Because we need to figure it out in the case of our right to own a gun, if we're humor, that is. And so how do we figure it out in general? Well, here's what humor says. If you want to figure out how weighty a prima facie right is, well, first figure out whether it's fundamental or derivative. If it's derivative, you need to figure out how important that fundamental right is to your plans in life, or to someone's plans in life in general, right? So if I have the right to print a newspaper, and I want to know how weighty is that right, I admit that it's prima facie, it has some weight, can be outweighed by things. Well, then I need to go and see, okay, well, what's the more fundamental right here? Well, it's freedom of speech. Okay, well, how important to someone's plans in life is freedom of speech? And the answer is probably going to be something like, well, really freaking important, right? Because how is anyone going, no matter what their plans are in life, how are they going to accomplish those plans if they cannot say what they want or think what they want, which, you know, freedom of thought usually grouped together with freedom of speech there. So that's the first question, is figure out how important the more fundamental right is to anyone's plans in life, right? How necessary it is, in other words. And the second thing is, how close is the relationship between the derivative right and the fundamental right? How do you have to be able to print a newspaper in order to exercise your right to free speech? Is it absolutely essential, or is it just one way of exercising your right to free speech? And that sort of thing. So in this case, you know, you obviously don't have to run a newspaper in order to be able to say what you need to say. But especially today, right? Compare this. I think your right to publish a newspaper may have gotten less weighty over time just because newspapers are such an outdated medium. But maybe 60, 80, 200 years ago, probably more as you go back in time up to a certain point, it was more important to your right to free speech that you be able to publish a newspaper, because there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, and at past a certain point, there were no phones, etc. Right? There were letters. You could write letters to people, and then to communicate with a mass audience, you could publish a newspaper. And so perhaps the right to publish a newspaper was weightier in the past, right? And not because of the first thing, because the right to free speech has stayed exactly as weighty the whole time. It's stayed as important to everyone's plans in life 200 years ago, just as important as it is today. But what has changed is the connection between publishing a newspaper and your right to free speech has gotten more distant or looser over time. There's not as tight of a connection. Okay. We're not going to do this last thing. I'm going to end this video here. And in the next one, we will consider Humer's argument that we do have a right, a non-overridden right to own a gun.